It begins not with a crown, but with a whisper inside a chapel, a name passed between candle flames, a glance exchanged between the queen in red velvet and the girl in shadow. Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish-born daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, had once sailed to England to be a bride, to stitch the house of Trastamara to the young and brittle dynasty of Tudor. And though her husband Prince Arthur died within months, she waited through 7 long years in limbo before being chosen again, this time by the new King Henry, tall and golden, a lion with a lute in his hands and an appetite for glory. Catherine became Queen of England with Latin on her lips and iron in her spine, a woman forged in the sun-drenched palaces of Granada and educated by the finest minds of Renaissance Spain. But it was in the cold halls of Westminster that she would fight the longest war of her life. Not against armies, not against heresy, but against another woman, a younger woman who would wear her jewels, sleep in her husband's bed, and one day take her place at the altar. Anne Boleyn was not meant to matter. She was the daughter of a diplomat, raised not in palaces, but in a fortified manor house in Kent called Hever, her hands more accustomed to books than rings, her eyes sharpened by years at the French court, where she had learned not only music and poetry, but also how clever women, could influence kings from behind lace veils. When she returned to England in the year 1522, she stepped into Queen Catherine's court, not as a rival, but as a lady-in-waiting, tasked with reading prayers, carrying messages, laughing at the right jokes and bowing at the right time. Her gowns modest, her tongue polite, her ambition silent for now. But the court of Henry was not a quiet place. It shifted like smoke across castles and rivers, from Greenwich to Richmond to Windsor. And within its walls swirled gossip, music, plots, foreign envoys, religious whispers, and more than a few ghosts. Catherine, now in her late 30s, moved through these chambers with the serene confidence of a woman who believed in the sanctity of her marriage, even though she had delivered Henry only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary, delicate and pious. Henry, restless and increasingly bitter at the lack of a son, began to cast his eyes beyond the altar rail, beyond his queen's weary prayers. And it was then, sometime in the middle of the decade, scholars place it around the year 1526, that Anne Boleyn, once invisible, became luminous in his gaze. The first letters came in French, the language of courtly love, where knights praised ladies with flowery metaphors and impossible vows. But Henry's letters were not the idle play of a bored monarch. They were tormented, aching, bold. He begged Anne to respond, confessed he had been wounded by her beauty for over a year, asked if she would become his only mistress, and, most tellingly, vowed to make her his wife, if only the Pope would annul his marriage to Catherine. Anne, for her part, did not fall at once into the role of lover. She delayed. She calculated. She responded with riddles and gifts, including a diamond hidden in a carved ship, a symbol of the storm they were both about to enter. Her resistance inflamed Henry further. He wrote her again and again. And when illness swept the court in the summer of 1528, Anne was sent away to Hever to escape the sweating sickness. And it was there, in her quiet room overlooking the drawbridge, that she read his words, now no longer in French, but in English, words that promised crowns, kingdoms, and desire. But while Anne healed and schemed, Catherine fought. She had seen this kind of woman before, had studied the rise and fall of seductresses in the courts of Europe, and she knew the game was not played in bedrooms but in books, in Latin texts and canon law. In private, she commissioned theologians, sent envoys to Rome, and began preparing for the legal and spiritual battle of her life. She had been married to Arthur, Henry's older brother. Yes, but their marriage, she swore under oath, had never been consummated. She wore that truth like armor. And when Henry began sending Anne his miniature portrait, a portrait, ironically, painted on Catherine's own commission, the betrayal became more than carnal. It became public. What most do not know is that Anne and Catherine owned the same book. Not just the same kind of book, but nearly identical copies of a French printed prayer book known as the Book of Hours. One now lies in New York, one in England, and both are marked by the hands of the women who owned them. Anne wrote in hers a gentle plea, "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day." Catherine's was marked with rubbed-away prayers, the text smudged by fingers that had traced each Latin word over and over in desperate hope. These books survived because women, not kings, kept them safe. Women who loved Catherine, who pitied Anne, who saw in both queens something worth preserving. The books were not weapons. They were relics of faith and of war. By the time the year 1529 arrived, the court was no longer a court. It was a battlefield. Henry petitioned Rome for an annulment. Catherine refused to step aside. Anne began to act not as mistress, but as queen-in-waiting, and the kingdom watched, breathless. Foreign powers chose sides. Cardinals arrived. The law was summoned, but no decree could silence the hearts of the two women who had become the sun and moon of Henry's sky. Catherine, unwavering in her piety, and Anne, rising with every scandal, every kiss, every whispered promise of a son to come. And somewhere, in the Tower, the axe was already being sharpened. When Anne Boleyn returned to England in the year 1522, the air of the court was already thick with the perfume of politics. Velvet and incense mingling with unspoken tension, she had left as a girl clever, unremarkable, half French in her manners and hesitant in her English, but she came back with something far more dangerous than beauty. She came back with poise. It wasn't the poise that could be taught in a manor house or even in a finishing school. It was the poise of a woman who had sat in rooms with queens, who had watched kings weep and courtiers lie, who had read ancient poetry by candlelight and then walked calmly into rooms full of men who underestimated her. Anne had learned how to move without making a sound, how to make her silences speak. And when she stepped into the royal court as a lady in waiting to Queen Catherine, that silence was what followed her, like a cloak stitched from secrets. The court, as it existed under Henry, was not just a palace or a place. It was a travelling theatre, a city of whispers on wheels, moving with the seasons, swelling with colour, heat, and music, from Greenwich to Richmond to Hampton Court. It moved like a serpent, winding its way through England's green and frost-covered landscapes, shedding skins of scandal as it went. Anne arrived into this world, not as a main player, but as a shadow on the edge of the stage. Her duties simple and rigid. She was to attend to the Queen, to help her dress, to kneel when appropriate, to read aloud when asked, to pray when commanded, and to disappear when dismissed. She wore her hair coiled tightly under a modest headdress. Hairdressers conservative. To her voice quiet. But even the stillest water hides sharp stones. And it did not take long for those who knew how to look to see that Anne was not like the others. Queen Catherine was, by then, no longer a young bride, but still a figure of immense dignity, cloaked in red velvet and cloth of gold. Her body adorned with jewels, gifted by foreign monarchs and popes. She spoke Latin fluently, corresponded with theologians, and held her household together with a blend of maternal discipline and royal grandeur. She had endured miscarriages and disappointment, but her faith never cracked. Her chamber was a world of order prayers at fixed hours, sacred music drifting beneath vaulted ceilings, and a quiet sorrow that clung to the tapestries like dust. Anne watched it all, absorbed the rhythms of this structured life, learned which priests the queen favoured, which hymns made her close her eyes, and somewhere in those long days of service, her own path began to flicker into existence, a path that would lead not to the altar, but to the throne. She was not yet the king's obsession. Not yet. That would come later. In these early years, Anne's mind was occupied not with seduction, but with survival. Her family, the Boleyns, were ambitious, but still outsiders. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat, but no true noble. Her mother, a Howard by blood, offered some prestige, but no true protection. For Anne to rise, she would have to build her own ladder. One careful word, one meaningful glance, one dangerous decision at a time. And as she read the Queen's books of hours, as she prayed aloud in softly measured Latin, she learned what power looked like from the seat beside it, not as a crown, but as control. But it was impossible not to be noticed. Even then, her dark eyes held a knowing gaze that lingered too long. Her voice quick, sarcastic when permitted, could cut deeper than a blade. Her wit turned heads before her body ever did, and in a court drowning in compliant beauty, Anne's refusal to yield made her magnetic. She danced with grace, but never coyness. She sang with passion, but never invitation. And when she stood beside Queen Catherine, she did not bow low enough. She was watching, measuring, learning. It was during these early years that she came dangerously close to leaving court altogether, not in disgrace, but in marriage. There were two proposals, both significant, both fatal in different ways. One was James Butler, her Irish cousin, a match her father desired, a union that would settle an old land dispute between the Boleyns and the Butlers. The other was Henry Percy, heir to the powerful Earl of Northumberland. And it was with Percy that Anne may have, for the first and last time in her life, loved without calculation. Their bond was strong enough to concern Cardinal Wolsey, who, whether out of politics or personal spite, intervened and ended it. The heartache humiliated her. The Queen's household whispered. The court moved on. Anne was sent away from court, back to Hever, with nothing to show for her efforts but a tarnished name and a soul simmering with ambition. And then, something shifted. In the year 1526, a glance, perhaps accidental, perhaps rehearsed, turned into a gaze. The king, Henry, now in his mid-30s, his patience fraying and his desire for a son becoming an obsession, noticed the girl who did not blush. He had loved her sister once, briefly and forgettably, but Anne was different. She did not chase. She did not swoon. She did not offer herself. She withheld, and it was that withholding that lured him. Like a moth to a flame, he circled her, and in that circling, everything began to change. She was recalled to court, this time not as a lady in waiting, but as the lady for whom the king lingered too long in the chapel gallery, whose laughter made the Queen's silence heavier, whose every movement rippled through the gossiping corridors like a dropped goblet. The court began to shift around her. Catherine noticed. The ladies whispered. The courtiers repositioned themselves like chess pieces. But Anne remained still. She refused the king's gifts, refused his touches, refused most dangerously of all his bed. When he wrote to her, she responded with tokens, riddles, histories, never quite words. And when the letters came in French, full of longing and fire, she read them in private, alone. She wanted more than affection. She wanted recognition, not as a mistress, but as a wife, as queen. And though she never said it aloud, though she never wrote it in ink, she made it known. With her silence, she would not be his plaything. She would be his equal. And in a court full of masks, that was the most dangerous ambition of all. long before the English crown rested on her brow, before the bitter trials, before the grey prayers whispered through sleepless nights. Catherine of Aragon had walked across marble floors beneath Andalusian sun, her footsteps echoing in palaces where Catholic monarchs once ruled like gods. She was born in the year 1485, in a world shaped by fire and conquest, the youngest daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, monarchs who united Spain, not with celebration, but with war. From the moment of her birth, Catherine was not a girl, she was a weapon, a marriage contract in a velvet cradle, a bargaining chip cradled in arms that smelled of myrrh and dust and smoke from the Alhambra. And while other children were nursed with lullabies, Catherine was raised with Latin, with the weight of lineage, with a name that was destined to leave its mark, not on paper, but on kingdoms. Her mother, Isabella, had seen the gaps in her own education, and vowed no daughter of hers would ever be less than any prince in Europe. And so Catherine, along with her sisters, was given the kind of education that made men tremble: Latin, theology, diplomacy, history, logic, and a clear understanding of power, not just its uses, but its cost. In the royal court of Castile, women were not ornaments. They were bloodlines that walked, minds that governed, queens that rode into battle in armor. From the age of 7, Catherine studied under the Italian humanist Alessandro Geraldini, who had once sailed with Columbus and later became the first bishop in the New World. He taught her that the Old World could be rewritten, and that the Bible, like the law, it was a matter of interpretation if you had the right tongue. By the time Catherine was 13, she could quote St. Augustine with the fluency of a scholar, and debate Erasmus with the confidence of someone who had watched her mother issue royal decrees beside her father on equal footing. But England did not want a queen like that. England wanted a bride. When she arrived on English soil in the year 1500, she was meant to marry Prince Arthur, the firstborn son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. It was a match that gave the Tudors legitimacy, for while their claim to the throne had been won with blood at Bosworth, it was still a fragile thing. And the alliance with Spain, with the House of Trastamara, gave it weight. She was 16, he was 15, and though their marriage lasted barely 5 months before Arthur died, the bond between England and Spain was not so easily severed. What followed was silence. 7 years of cold waiting, of letters sent and ignored, of gowns unworn, of suitors turned away. 7 years of limbo, as Henry VII stalled, calculating whether the Spanish alliance was still worth the dowry. 7 years in which Catherine endured humiliation with quiet steel, her status uncertain, her future unwritten. But through it all, she prayed, she wrote, she waited. And then Henry died, and the boy she had known, Arthur's younger brother, rose to the throne as Henry VIII, newly crowned, golden-haired, barely 18, and burning with the need to assert himself. He married her within weeks. It was, in those early years, a passionate match. He called her his rose without a thorn, and she bore him son after son, none of whom lived, except one, a daughter, Mary. And though the court wore smiles, the seed of Henry's doubt had already been planted. Catherine was now over 30. Her womb, once seen as the engine of a dynasty, became instead a tomb. And still, she knelt beside him in chapel. Still, she advised him on foreign policy. Still, she embroidered the emblems of Tudor and Trastamara onto his banners, weaving her blood into his kingdom. But no crown is safe when the king begins to count ghosts. It was in this space, this narrowing corridor between loyalty and loss, that Catherine's true power emerged. When others would have wept, she turned to theology. When others would have begged, she turned to Rome. When Henry began to wander not yet toward Anne, but toward something new, Catherine strengthened her alliances with Spain, with the papacy, with every corner of Christendom that still respected the sanctity of marriage. She commissioned books, sent secret letters to Rome, and reminded anyone who would listen that her marriage had been approved by a papal dispensation and that her first had never been consummated. In England, it was treason to deny the Queen's title. In Catherine's eyes, it was treason to believe she would ever lose it. Yet even the most devout prayers cannot stop a king whose eyes have turned toward another. Still, Catherine refused to yield. She wore her crown to court. She sat beside Henry in public. She smiled while her heart bled. And in private, she fought. When Anne Boleyn appeared at court and rose through the ranks with eyes that did not bow, Catherine saw what others dismissed. She knew ambition when it walked in a woman's dress. She recognized the hunger, the stillness, the posture of a girl not in love, but in strategy. And Catherine prepared. There is a portrait of Catherine from around this time, painted in miniature, the Latin inscription surrounding her face like a silent chant, Queen by law, wife by God's blessing. It was one of many she had commissioned, not out of vanity, but as propaganda sent to nobles, friends, ambassadors, all bearing her likeness, all reminding England who the true Queen was. She understood optics. She understood that memory was malleable, that whoever controlled the image controlled the narrative. Henry may have sent Anne a bracelet bearing his picture, but that picture had been painted under Catherine's roof, paid for by her coin, chosen by her eyes. And yet, beneath all this power, all this performance, there lived the child of Castile, who still believed in something higher than politics. Her faith had not bent, not when Arthur died, not when her sons died, not when her husband's gaze shifted to another. She still knelt, still prayed, still believed that God, in his justice, would not abandon her. But England was changing. The court no longer whispered her name with reverence. The king no longer sought her counsel. The air grew colder, and the woman who had once stood beneath Spanish sun now sat alone in dim stone halls, her books of hours open, her fingers tracing lines already worn smooth by 1,000 dawns of devotion. In the year 1527, she learned that Henry had begun seeking annulment, that Rome had been petitioned, that Anne Boleyn had agreed to marry the king if he left his wife. And still, Catherine did not flinch. She ordered new prayers written. She recommissioned her portraits. She reminded her daughter Mary of her birthright. Because Catherine of Aragon did not know how to surrender, and in the silence of her chapel, the Queen began to prepare, not for survival but for battle. The year was 1526. And within the torchlit chambers of Henry's court, a different kind of fever had taken hold. Not the kind that killed in hours, like the sweating sickness that haunted the corridors of Greenwich, but a fever of obsession, one that dripped like wax from the king's heart into the ink of every letter he would write in secret. It began in French, a language Henry used for romance, though not fluently, which made his phrases stumble, raw and unpolished, like a boy trying to be a poet. But the intent behind his clumsy declarations was unmistakable. He was not simply writing to Anne Boleyn, he was offering her the crown. And with every word he wrote, Ma maîtresse et amie, he pulled himself further from his queen and closer to the woman who would one day unmake him. Anne had refused him. That was the miracle, the madness, the mechanism that turned her from a curiosity into an obsession. She did not swoon. She did not run. She did not fall into his arms like her sister Mary once had. Anne played the oldest game with the newest rules. She made herself necessary. And when Henry begged her to be his mistress, she answered with riddles, with silence, with half smiles and carved gifts, a diamond in the shape of a ship tossed in a storm, a metaphor and a warning all in one. It wasn't enough for her to be loved. She wanted to be crowned. And so Henry King of England and defender of the faith, began to write her love letters, in which he called himself her loyal servant, her knight wounded by the dart of love. His signatures ending with hearts drawn around their initials, H and A, as if the ink could seal what God had joined elsewhere. The Queen received none of these letters, but she felt them as if they had been branded across her skin. Catherine was no fool. She had seen how the king lingered at Anne's side, how the girl's laughter became music that silenced entire rooms, how courtiers shifted like shadows around her, trying to position themselves in the orbit of a rising sun. She noticed how Anne's gowns grew more luxurious, how her place in the Queen's household shifted from shadow to centerpiece, how even the tapestries seemed to hold their breath when the king passed. And Catherine, trained since birth to read subtext more fluently than scripture, began to prepare for a war that would be fought, not with swords, but with portraits, proclamations, and prayers. Henry's letters grew bolder. He began to write not just of longing, but of possession. He offered Anne everything: titles, lands, the promise of a son, and, most dangerously, his vow to marry her, provided he could be rid of Catherine. Anne's replies are lost to time, but Henry's responses show a man consumed. He thanks her for her gifts, calls her kindness a comfort in his torment, and writes again and again of her body in veiled and then unveiled terms. In one letter, he speaks of her pretty duckies, a Tudor slang for breasts, and yearns to kiss them. The language shifted, no longer French, no longer courtly, now English, now flesh, now urgent. Anne had pulled the king across a line that could not be uncrossed. He no longer wanted her, he needed her, and in needing her, he would destroy everything that stood in the way. And so came the letters that burned the Queen's hands, not because she read them, but because they were all around her. She saw them in the way the king smiled too broadly when Anne entered a room. She heard them in the rustle of silk behind her during Mass. She felt them in the absence of her husband's gaze, in the way he no longer sought her counsel in matters of state, no longer reached for her hand in public, no longer asked her to share in the plans for their daughter Mary's future. Instead, he sent her miniatures, tiny portraits of himself, painted with care and pride, gifts to ambassadors, friends, even to Anne. And the cruelest cut of all, some of those portraits had been commissioned by Catherine herself. Imagine the sting to see your husband's face, painted at your request, now dangling from a bracelet worn by the girl who meant to steal your crown. But Catherine did not cry. She prepared. She commissioned new images, new messages. She sent letters to Rome, reminding the Pope of the sanctity of her marriage, the dispensation granted years earlier that had allowed her to marry Henry after Arthur's death. She gathered legal minds, summoned theologians, and spoke of her daughter Mary, not just as a child, but as an heir. She would not be replaced by a girl with a French education and a clever tongue. Not quietly, not ever. There is a moment quiet, terrible, intimate when Anne, secluded at Hever, due to the outbreak of the sweating sickness in the summer of 1528, lay ill beside her father, unsure if she would live, while Henry, terrified of death, fled court and sent her desperate letters from afar. One can almost see her in that chamber, pale, sweating, with the windows shuttered against the plague, clutching the latest letter to her chest, while her hands shook and her vision blurred. Outside, servants whispered. Inside, Anne read the king's words again and again. What joy can be greater upon earth than to have the company of her who is dearest to me, whose pretty duckies I trust shortly to kiss, and somewhere, in the same castle, in a room not far away, her father Thomas waited, knowing that if his daughter survived this illness, she would become something more than his child. She would become queen. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the kingdom, Catherine knelt before an altar, with blood in her mouth and fire in her bones. She was not afraid of Anne. She had known women like her before, the ones who came with silk and perfume and ambition hidden behind eyelashes. But she knew something Anne did not: how to survive in silence, how to command an army without raising her voice, how to bleed without showing the wound. She had lost sons, she had lost youth, but she had not lost her throne, not yet. And so the battle raged in parchment and paint, in kisses promised and prayers whispered, in rooms heavy with perfume and halls echoing with foreign languages. Henry was at the centre, a man torn between devotion and desire, between the quiet loyalty of the wife who had stood beside him since he first wore the crown, and the intoxicating pull of the woman who offered him a future soaked in gold and sons and glory. And somewhere between them, in the chapel, in the council chamber, in the bedrooms where neither woman slept well, the future of England trembled. Two women, one crown, and a king who no longer remembered how to love without destroying everything he touched. It came like a breath held too long. No warning, no trumpet, no final prayer, only sweat. Sudden, cold, and fatal. The sweating sickness had returned to England in the summer of the year 1528. Slipping through the narrow halls of the court like a ghost, no one could see, and everyone feared. It moved faster than fear itself. A man could be well at breakfast, trembling by dinner, and dead before the stars returned. There was no cure, no protection, no mercy. It struck rich and poor alike, though it always seemed to find its way into palaces, as if it were drawn to the scent of silk, power, and ambition. And this time, it came for Anne Boleyn. At first, it was a rumour, whispered by servants outside the Queen's chambers, murmured by pages as they passed cups to nobles who no longer drank. One of Anne's ladies had fallen ill, then another, then Anne herself, flushed, fevered, and taken quickly away from court, escorted by her father and sent back to Hever Castle, where the air was cleaner and the walls older, and where the king who feared disease more than sin would never dare to follow. It was there, in the soft gloom of her childhood bedroom, that Anne lay trembling, the sheets damp beneath her body, her breath shallow, her skin burning with the same ambition that had brought her this far and might now burn her out of existence. Hever was not the court. It was quiet. The floors did not echo with music or secrets. The walls did not press in with gossip. Here, the only sound was the ticking of death, second by second, and the murmur of servants who had known Anne as a girl, now standing helpless beside her as she writhed and moaned in the darkness. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, paced the halls like a man already in mourning. Her sister Mary, perhaps, sent word from afar. Her brother-in-law William Carey, young, golden, careless, caught the disease too. But unlike Anne, he did not rise from the bed. He died, quickly, painfully, and quietly, as all the ambitious sometimes do. For Henry, the news was a knife he could not avoid. He had played at chivalry. He had written her poems, letters, promises. But in this moment, she was no longer his muse. She was a woman dying in exile. He could not touch her, could not protect her. You could not even send his doctors, for to enter that plague-struck castle was to gamble one's breath. But he did the only thing he could do. He wrote, desperately, over and over. His letters now carried no riddles, no flirtation. They were drenched in panic. He called her his beloved. He pleaded for news. He promised her the crown, if only she would live. And with every line, the mask of the king slipped, and underneath it was not Henry VIII the lion, the tyrant, the monarch, but Henry the man, terrified and alone. Anne, barely conscious, read his words in fevered intervals. They were brought to her by servants, perhaps her brother George, who rode from court in haste, bearing parchment as if it were medicine. She clutched them in shaking hands. She tried to write back. Whether she succeeded, no one knows. Her own letters have vanished, burned, lost, or hidden. But his letters survived, echoing with the desperation of a man who believed the world might end with the death of a woman who had never even lain in his bed. And still, Anna did not die. She remained for days on the edge, floating somewhere between this world and the next, until, slowly, her fever broke. Her skin cool, her hands stopped trembling. Her eyes, once clouded, focused again. And in that moment alone, in the quiet aftermath, perhaps looking through the leaded glass of her chamber window onto the castle drawbridge below, Anne Boleyn understood something few ever do. She had been given a second life, and she would not waste it. When she rose from her bed, she was no longer the girl who had danced in silk or traded jokes with courtiers. She was not even the woman who had rejected a king's bed in pursuit of a crown. She was something new, something harder, something forged, because death had almost taken her, and had taken William Carey instead, and now she returned to the world like a ghost in reverse. Reborn, sharp-eyed, and more dangerous than ever. The girl Henry had loved was gone. The woman he had nearly lost was now the queen he would destroy kingdoms for. Back at court, Henry prepared for her return. He wrote again. This time in English, no more French artifice. No more courtly masks. His words were plain, bold, seared with need. What joy can be greater upon earth, he wrote, than to have the company of her who is dearest to me. He told her he wished to hold her. He spoke of her body now with brutal clarity, using the slang of the court duckies, a word that turned Anne's breasts into something childlike, possessive, absurd. But she read the lines and said nothing, for she understood now what kind of love this was. It was not love that waits. It was not love that listens. It was hunger, and hunger, when fed, only grows more ravenous. Anne recovered in Hever through the late summer and early autumn of that year, and when she returned to court, the change in her was unmistakable. She no longer smiled so freely. Her gowns were darker, her voice keener, her glances sharper. She walked not as a mistress, but as a queen in waiting, and the court, as courts always do, adapted to her rise. Nobles who had once whispered jokes behind her back now angled their bodies toward her when she passed. Ambassadors began to write her name beside the king's, and Catherine, watching from the edge of her own fading world, I saw it all with eyes that had never missed a thing. This was no longer a flirtation. It was a regime change, and in that moment, the disease that had nearly taken Anne's life revealed its cruelest truth. It had made her unstoppable. For what can a woman fear? After she has touched death and lived, what can stop her? When she has watched others perish in her place, Anne had survived the sweating sickness. But she had not left it behind. She carried its memory with her now, like a perfume, only she could smell. And in that scent was a vow if she was to wear the crown. It would not be borrowed. It would be taken. She was not a woman who wept easily. Not when she bled for her sons who never lived. Not when her husband's mouth curled into silence. Not when her crown began to tilt. Catherine of Aragon was not made for surrender. And in the cold corridors of the royal palaces, where laughter had turned brittle and glances cut deeper than daggers, she did what her mother, Queen Isabella of Castile, had taught her to do from childhood when power begins to slip. Bind it with parchment, ink, and law, not with tears. And so, in the autumn of the year 1528, as the king grew louder in his love for Anne Boleyn, and the court swirled like perfume around a new sun, Catherine, the rightful Queen of England, sat beside a candle and began her war. She began with letters, not love letters like the ones Anne received from the king, but diplomatic ones, long and measured, written in Latin and Spanish, and sometimes in English when the recipient required plainness. She wrote to Rome. She wrote to her nephew, the Emperor Charles. She wrote to cardinals, bishops, choulas, and noble women across Europe. Each letter was a thread in a web, binding her not just to her marriage, but to the very foundations of Europe's religious and legal order. She reminded them all with elegance, with precision, with the patience of a woman who had waited 7 years for Henry once before, that her marriage had been sanctioned by the Pope, that she had never consummated her union with Arthur, that she had been crowned by God and by the people, and that any attempt to undo her queenship was not merely personal treachery, but spiritual heresy. Her pen moved like a blade, every curve of ink slicing through the silence of her isolation. But it wasn't enough to write, so she began to be seen. Catherine, who had once lived in the golden glow of early Tudor harmony, now stepped into court, not as wife, but as symbol. She wore her finest Spanish gowns, embroidered with the pomegranate of Granada, rich with cloth of gold, trimmed with black to remind the kingdom of mourning and dignity. She commissioned miniature portraits of herself, not out of vanity but as quiet weapons, to be sent to loyal courtiers and uncertain allies. Each one bore a Latin inscription, declarations of faith, affirmations of her role, veiled challenges to the king's audacity. She smiled in none of them. She stared outward, steady and serene, as if to say, "You may forget me, but I have not forgotten who I am." And even in her prayers, Catherine made war. She ordered new Latin devotions written, prayers for truth, prayers for fortitude, prayers that were also declarations of sovereignty. She clutched her Book of Hours so tightly, so frequently, that some of its pages, especially those with the handwritten prayers added on its front flyleaf, grew soft, worn. The ink nearly vanished from being touched over and over. Hers was not the passive piety of a woman hoping for a miracle. It was the ironclad discipline of a monarch invoking heaven as both shield and sword. She was not alone in this fight. Her daughter Mary, pale, devout, 12 years old, understood enough to kneel beside her mother and ask why the king no longer came to say good night. Her ladies, older now, women who had watched Catherine rise from widow to queen, followed her quietly, eyes lowered, hearts trembling. Even some of the men, those who remembered the early days of the reign, the golden summers before the miscarriages, and the frost between royal beds. I began to speak her name with reverence once more. They saw in her not just a queen betrayed, but a woman standing her ground against a whirlwind. And yet, the whirlwind gathered. Anne returned to court, recovered, transformed, sharper than before. She did not fight Catherine with law or parchment. She fought with presence. Her gowns were not the modest ones she had once worn. Now they shimmered with silver thread, and her neckline dipped just low enough to remind the room that the king's attention had a direction. She no longer curtsied as deeply. Her voice, once soft, now rang with certainty. And behind her, around her, moved a new circle of courtiers, young men with ambition in their blood, and nobles, who had begun to whisper that perhaps the Pope had no business in English marriage at all. They did not yet dare call her queen, but they stopped calling her harlot. In this atmosphere, Henry changed. He no longer asked Catherine for counsel. He no longer sat beside her at mass. He no longer smiled in her direction, unless foreign dignitaries watched. And when the Spanish ambassador asked about the Queen, Henry's answers grew colder, more clipped. He had made up his mind. He would be free. He would have Anne. And if the church in Rome refused to untie the knot he now called a mistake, then perhaps the church in England would be made to do it for him. And still, Catherine refused to kneel. She was summoned, questioned, pressed. Her confession about her first marriage to Arthur was demanded again. Was the marriage consummated? Did she speak the truth? Her reply never changed. She had sworn it on her soul. She would swear it again. She had never lain with Arthur as man and wife. She had married Henry lawfully. She was his queen. She would not go. Not to a nunnery. Not to Spain. Not to anywhere but the grave. And behind her, gathering like a storm cloud, was a rising chorus of women old allies. New sympathizers. The quiet army of England's mothers and daughters who still looked at Catherine and saw something greater than betrayal. They saw resolve. They saw legitimacy. They saw the last true queen of an old world being trampled under the boots of a new one. But Catherine did not plead for their pity. She fought on. She sharpened her faith into a spear and held it to the king's conscience. She reminded the world that justice could not be rewritten by lust, that crowns could not be traded for kisses, that queens were not discarded like empty goblets, and in the shadows of his chambers, perhaps Henry remembered what Catherine had been, not just his wife, but his partner in rule, his equal in diplomacy, the woman who had stood beside him when his kingdom was young and his enemies many. But memory cannot hold back revolution, and Catherine, proud, prayerful, unyielding, stood like a monument to a world that was about to crumble beneath her feet. There is a moment not of battle, nor of kiss, nor of blood that stands stranger than any throne-room argument or papal decree in this long and bitter war between two women. It did not happen in public. It did not even happen while they breathed, but centuries later, in a quiet exhibition room at Hever Castle, the place where Anne Boleyn once wept and waited and wrote her secrets to a king, two objects were laid side by side, small, velvet-bound, worn by fingers long dead. Two books, nearly identical, printed in Paris in the year 1527, illuminated in gold leaf, and decorated with borders that whispered the wealth of their owners. One had belonged to Anne Boleyn, the other to Catherine of Aragon, and they should never have met again. Yet there they were, books of hours, Catholic prayer books, sacred and personal, designed to guide the faithful through the 8 canonical hours of the day. Their pages marked by prayers for dawn, for dusk, for suffering, for salvation. They were not mere books. They were companions. Women wrote inside them, prayed over them, passed them down through blood and silence. And these two, one carried by a woman who was ascending toward a throne she would not keep, the other held by a queen who refused to descend from the one she already wore, spoke a language that no sword could sever. Anne's book bears her handwriting, cut cruelly by a later binder who did not recognize the weight of what he trimmed. At the bottom of a page, almost vanished by time, she had written in her own hand, "Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day." A line of poetry, a request, a haunting. It is signed by her, or it was meant to be, before the paper was sliced too close, as if the edge of her name still fought to be known. That line simple, aching, is perhaps the closest the world will ever get to Anne's soul without a crown, without Henry, without history looming over her shoulder. It is a woman asking not to be erased. Catherine's book holds no such visible signature, but its pages, the fly-leaves at the front, are heavy with Latin prayers written in her time, believed to have been added at the moment of the book's creation, rubbed nearly blank by years of repeated touch. These prayers were not whispered delicately. They were traced by fingers that sought salvation in repetition, by a queen who had been cast aside, who held the pages not as ornament but as armor. The ink has faded, but the indentation remains like breath in the snow. Where Anne had hope, Catherine had devotion. Where Anne inscribed a memory, Catherine wore the text away with need. And there is something almost cruel, or perhaps divine, in the fact that these two books were printed by the same man in the same year, in the same city. Carried across the Channel, to two different women, bound by one man's name. There is no evidence they were given to them together. No proof that Catherine ever held hers while Anne held hers. But what if they did? What if, in some long-forgotten chamber in 1527, when Anne was still just a lady in waiting and Catherine still wore her crown with certainty, the books were gifted by the same priest, the same courtier, perhaps handed out during a feast day or a moment of religious unity, a symbol of piety meant to link the Queen with the women of her household. What if they read them together, not alone, not side by side, but in the same chapel, with the same candles flickering above them, the same psalms on their tongues? Anne, still waiting to be noticed. Catherine, still believing she would never be threatened. Perhaps they did not look at each other that day. Perhaps they did. Perhaps Anne watched the Queen's lips move and whispered the same words just a little faster. Just a little louder. Perhaps Catherine, with the instinct of a woman who sees through veils, I felt something tighten in her chest, as the girl beside her turned a page. And perhaps neither of them knew that one day their lives would be reduced not to a battle, not to a trial, not even to a beheading, but to the pages of these two books, preserved not by kings or councils, but by the hands of women who remembered them differently. Anne's book survived because a network of women kept it. Not noblemen, not scholars, but Kentish women, local to Hever, some of them tied by blood to the Guildford and Gage families. Households that had once served Catherine with loyalty. The book passed quietly from hand to hand. Names were added, then scraped away. Ink was erased. Ownership blurred. But the book was never lost. It was never destroyed. And in that quiet survival, there is something stronger than triumph. There is loyalty, not to the throne, but to the woman. Catherine's book followed the same strange path. It too ended up in private hands. It too was kept not by politicians but by those who had stood at her side and refused to forget her dignity, even when England did. Eventually, it left the country. It sailed across oceans. It now lives in New York. But for a brief, astonishing moment in the modern age, the two books were reunited, placed within inches of one another. After 5 centuries of exile and fire and dust, they were never meant to meet again. But they did, and in that quiet room, under glass, something strange happened. They did not speak, because books do not speak, but they listened, and in that silence, they remembered. One woman wrote herself into her book, so she would not be forgotten. The other wore hers away, praying that her memory would outlast betrayal. And together, they have. Not because of Henry, but in spite of him. The room does not look like history. It smells of old plumbing and faded perfume. And the walls are dressed in pale pink tiles. A garish remnant of the 1970s, when Lady Irene Astor ruled Hever Castle not with a crown, but with taste and leisure. The bath is pink. The scale is pink. Even the mirror seems blushed with forgotten memories. It is the last place one would expect to find a queen, and yet, beneath the strange scent of talcum and the quiet hum of forgotten fixtures, something still lingers, not a ghost, not a shadow, but the presence of a decision that changed the world. For here, in this strange, mismatched chamber that once might have been a dressing room, a writing corner, a place where lace was unpinned and secrets unfolded, Anne Boleyn is believed to have read the final letter, the one where Henry asked no, demanded her heart, her loyalty, her body, her future, and here she is thought to have said yes. It was late in the year, 1528. The plague had passed, leaving its silence behind like a bloodstain too large to hide. Anne had recovered. William Carey had not. Her father, once shaken, now stood straighter in court. His ambition no longer veiled in hesitation. The king had resumed his letters, his declarations, his promises no longer cloaked in the poetic obfuscations of French, but raw and immediate in English, as if even the language of courtly love had lost patience. He no longer offered his heart. He offered his throne. His letters dripped with want, but also with something more dangerous certainty. He believed that God wanted him free. That destiny was now attached to Anne's wrist like a ribbon, that no priest, no pope, no parliament would stand between him and the son he believed she could give him. Anne had resisted longer than any woman at court would have dared. She had rejected his gifts, turned from his kisses, denied him even the sanctuary of her bed. And this was not coyness. This was not chastity. This was strategy. Anne understood power the way a general understands terrain. It was not held. It was maneuvered. And to surrender too soon was to become another mistress. To surrender too late was to be replaced. She had walked that knife edge for nearly 2 years. And now, in this room, far from the court, she stood alone with a letter in her hands and the weight of a kingdom in her lungs. There may have been a mirror here, smaller, simpler, framed in wood or silver, not yet replaced by the wide pink pane that sits there now. She might have stood before it, holding the king's words, reading them aloud just once, just to hear them in the air. Will you do the office of a true loyal mistress and friend, he had written, before promising to take no other, if she would only be his. And yet the words that mattered were buried deeper, behind the flattery, behind the desperate yearning. He had said he would make her his wife, not a mistress, not a lover, a wife, the queen. Perhaps she read it once. Perhaps she read it 100 times. And then she chose. Anne Boleyn was not in love. Not the way girls are in tapestries and ballads. She had once loved Henry VIII, and that had been crushed. She had learned that love without advantage was dangerous, that women who loved openly were discarded quietly. But Henry, her Henry, was something different. He was a kingdom wrapped in flesh, a path to power paved with holy oil and swords. She did not want to merely hold his heart. She wanted to wear his crown, and for that, she would risk everything. There is a story unconfirmed, whispered like a psalm behind a priest's back, that Anne kept his letters in this very room, that she hid them in the drawers, or in the gaps between the wooden panels, or behind the looking glass, away from the hands of gossips and the eyes of her own father. She would sit here, writing back in careful ink, her script precise, every stroke a balance between obedience and ambition. And when she sealed those letters with wax, she was not just answering a king, she was rearranging the fate of England. Outside the window still visible today is the castle's drawbridge, the same one that would have rattled when riders came bearing royal seals and silken ribbons. Anne could have seen them coming. George Boleyn, her brother, rode often between Hever and court, acting as messenger and shield, delivering Henry's thoughts and carrying Anne's silence in return. And as the hooves approached, as the flag-bearing horses shimmered in the mist, Anne might have watched from that window, heart steady, fingers cold, knowing that every letter brought her closer, not just to the throne, but to the tower, for saying yes meant no return. Saying yes meant war with Rome. Saying yes meant Catherine would become her enemy. Saying yes meant that she would be loved too much and hated even more. But Anne said yes anyway, and when she returned to court, she no longer lingered in the background. She stood in the center of every room. Her gowns bore French lace. Her smile curled like a secret. She dared others to guess. Her voice carried, and Henry, blinded by desire and destiny, watched her move as if she were already crowned. The court began to shift. Some nobles whispered. Others bowed. Foreign ambassadors sent letters across the sea. Catherine's allies stiffened with horror, and behind every door, someone asked the same question. Had the girl said yes? She had. But she had also said no to every kiss that came before the altar, to every touch that came without a ring. She had given the king only her promise, not her body. Not yet. And in that refusal, Anne did what no other woman had done. She turned the most powerful man in England into a beggar. And he begged, and he plotted, and he prepared to change the very structure of Christendom to have her because she had said yes. And now, the storm had no more reason to wait. The year turned. The page of England's history curled with the sound of Latin and the scrape of quills on parchment, and the brittle silence that follows a declaration too loud to take back. It was now 1529. The storm that had been whispering at the edges of the court for half a decade no longer waited behind veils. It had arrived, with robes, with witnesses, with legal scrolls and trembling priests, and with a question that no king had dared ask in public since the birth of Christendom's marriage laws: was Henry VIII truly married, or had he been living in sin all along? And the Spanish queen he had crowned beside him was no queen at all. At Blackfriars in London, under ceilings that had once echoed only with chants and incense, the royal trial began. Cardinals were summoned. The great Lorenzo Campeggio arrived from Rome, worn from travel, wrapped in the authority of the Pope, holding in his weary hands not justice, but delay. Opposite him sat Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's own man, caught between obedience to Rome and obedience to Henry, and seated between them, not literally but spiritually, stood two women, one who would not move and one who would not kneel. Catherine came first, not as a broken wife, but as a queen in full dignity. She wore her Spanish black, the colour of Castile, of widowhood, of iron. She bowed to the court, but not to the process. She stood in the centre of that sacred place and made her speech not in fear, not in sorrow, but in thunder. Her voice rang with the conviction of a woman who had spoken truth from the beginning and had never once changed her story. "My lord," she said, addressing Henry directly, "before all the judges and witnesses, I am your true and lawful wife, and you know it." She reminded the room that she had come to England a virgin, that her marriage had been sanctioned by the Pope, that she had been crowned queen, and that she had borne him a daughter in good faith. And then, in one unforgettable gesture, she crossed the chamber to where Henry sat and knelt at his feet, not in submission, but in challenge. And after that, she turned her back and walked out of the court, never to return. Anne, elsewhere, waited in silence. She could not attend the trial. She could not show her face in public beside the king, while Catherine's voice still rang in the rafters. But she was there in every parchment passed, every whisper traded between bishop and courtier. She knew that Henry had already decided. The trial was theatre. The outcome would be what he willed. But she also knew what Catherine knew, that nothing in England was ever simple. Rome hesitated. Charles VI, the Holy Roman Emperor and Catherine's nephew, made it known that he would not accept his aunt's humiliation. The Pope delayed. Campeggio stalled. And Wolsey, once the most powerful man in the land after the king, now found himself trapped in a battle between two queens and one man who had run out of patience. Still, Anne waited. She had said yes, and the yes had changed everything. She now lived not as queen, not yet, but as something in between. Her rooms at court were closer to the king's than ever before. Her influence was undeniable. Ambassadors reported that nothing could reach the king's ear without passing through Anne's smile. She appointed her own servants. She shaped policy. She whispered names for promotions, and had them granted. She was no longer the lady in waiting. She was the heir around the throne. And yet, she was still not crowned. For that, a marriage was needed. And for a marriage, a freedom. But freedom would not come from Rome. And so Henry began to pull at the ropes that tied England to the Pope. He turned to scholars, to reformers, to ancient texts that could be twisted into justification. He argued that Leviticus forbade him from marrying his brother's widow, even if the Pope had once allowed it. He claimed his soul was damned by the lack of a male heir. He began to speak openly of his conscience, and behind that word conscience stood Anne, silent, smiling, certain. Catherine, meanwhile, was removed from court, her title revoked, her rooms given to Anne, but she did not stop fighting. From exile, she wrote, she prayed, she reminded every ambassador, every priest, every noble who had once knelt before her that she had not stepped down, had not agreed, had not signed away her rights. She still called herself queen. She still referred to Mary as princess, and even in isolation, she frightened Anne more than any bishop. By the year 1530, Thomas Wolsey had fallen, stripped of power, disgraced. He died in Leicester on his way to trial. His last words, a murmur of regret that he had served his king too well. In his place rose Thomas Cromwell, a man with colder eyes and firmer hands. Under Cromwell's guidance, England moved faster towards schism. Parliament passed laws. Clerge Bode and Henry, with Anne at his side, declared that he would be master of his own kingdom and of his own marriage. The blade had not yet fallen, but it had been sharpened. And then, one day, no trumpets. No witnesses. Anne and Henry were married in secret. The date remains disputed. The witnesses unnamed, but the ceremony was real. She had waited 6 years. Now she was his wife, and soon after, she was crowned. The procession through London was magnificent, but stained with the silence of the people. Where Catherine had been cheered, Anne was watched. Her gown shimmered with Tudor roses. Her belly was already round. She walked barefooted into Westminster Abbey. She carried the orb. She wore the crown, and the stone beneath her feet remembered Catherine, and it waited, because the blade does not strike without purpose. It waits for disobedience, for betrayal, for disappointment. Anne was now queen, but she had no heir. Not yet, and all England, every courtier, every ambassador, every midwife, and every woman who had ever waited too long for a son, watched the door of her bedchamber like it was the mouth of a tomb, because the same people who had watched her rise would soon watch her fall, and the blade would not wait forever.